So if you would, go ahead and fire up the SportsStore application, kind of where we started off last week. So what I want to do first is go over some of the order processing logic, some of the checkout logic. I know that a lot of you have started on that, so maybe you're kind of mostly done with that. But I want to go through a few different pieces. I'm going to kind of start from the beginning of that process, that checkout process, and kind of walk through the steps, because there's a few things I want to discuss and take a look at. And then the thing I want to get to is then saving that order to the database. Okay, so because the code that you have from the book has given you a way to say, okay, well, I can check out, and it just sends an email, but it's not recorded in the database anywhere, right? Which is an issue, right? We'd like to, once we make an order, we'd like to save that to the database so we can go back and do things with it later. Okay, like say, hey, how many people ordered this? Who ordered that? Have we shipped it out yet? You know, when did we ship it? Did it get lost in shipping? All those kind of things we can't, or doing returns, we can't track all those things if we're only sending an email. So that's going to give us the entry point to doing all that. Once we're done with that, the rest of the day you have to kind of finish up labs, anything that's outstanding. And I do need to follow up. I meant to do this last week, but I need to follow up with everybody on work ethic and things like that. So I'll kind of be calling people out one by one to have those meetings after as part of that class today. So let's start with the cart. So I'm going to pop open the cart controller. And the first thing I want to do is set up this checkout page, right? So obviously the first thing I need to add is an action method for that. So I'm going to add in public action result, and this is going to be the checkout action. It needs a cart, and this is going to be the get version. So I've got the initial get version, right? Well, what do I need to do in this initial version? I need to just show the view. So let's start with that. So I'm going to show the view here. So that's there. Let's add in the version that's post. So starting there. Now remember that cart now is coming from that cart model binder. The model binder is actually working on building that cart from the session data. Okay. One thing I want to do. Oops. Do I not? Oh, I need to add in that class. I add in the shipping details class because I never actually added it. Add new class. And let me add, yep.
Why do we need to pass cart into the get?
I'll come back to that in a minute. There's one issue I want to kind of resolve. I need to grab the version that was from the book because I have a shipping details class that I've made some changes to. So if I go to my desktop, chapter 9, there's where I want. Okay, so adding in that shipping details class. There we go. So you're asking about why do we want the cart here, okay? So at the moment I'm not doing anything with it, right? So If the code is as is, I'm not doing anything with it. I'll come back to there's a reason that I want it there, okay? Because there is a check I want to do there. I just haven't put it in yet. So there is a reason that we want it there, but I haven't gotten to it yet. So common thing when we have that post version, what's the first thing we need to do generally when we post back? Graham?
Check if the model state's valid.
Correct. So we want to say, is the model state valid? If not, we're just going to re-show the form with this original data, right? So that should be somewhere in your second checkout method to say, hey, re-show the view if it's invalid. Okay. Now let's look at what this looks like right now. So I'm going to go through here. Okay, start without debugging. I've already created my cart view. Okay. So if I check out now, notice I don't have anything in my cart, right? Okay, it's going to prompt me and say, hey, I need to fill in these things. Okay? That's all fine and good. I'm going to go ahead and fill those in using autofill and say complete order. What's going on? Oh, I haven't put the last line in. When I submit it, it's just re-showing it. I need to put that redirect in at the end. So once you're done, once you've filled out and completed your order, I want to actually redirect you back to the completed page. Now I have two options here, right? I could say view completed, or I could say redirect to action completed, right? What's the difference? Why might I want to do one over the other? This versus that. What's the difference between those two?
If you use view, then the URL won't change, and refreshing the page will cause another submit.
Correct. So if I just do this, my URL that I'm at will be URL checkout, right? If I refresh the page, I'll be ordering another set of items. I don't want to do that. So if I say redirect to action, that'll redirect them to cart completed. If they refresh, they won't order again. That makes sense? So that's why I want to make sure I'm doing redirect completed as a redirect to action as the last thing I do. Now, if I just run this as is, we're going to get an error, and let me show you what that is so you can fix that when you see it. See, it's gone to cart completed, but it said resource not found. I got 404 error, right? So the URL changed. I went from cart checkout to cart completed, like I wanted to. Okay. And if we look in the views folder, I do have a completed view, right? I do have a completed view. So why am I getting a 404 error?
You don't have a get action result for it, so which is what redirect to action is trying to find.
So say that more simply. I think you're on the right track.
The controller doesn't know where to render the page.
Well, there's a view, right? There's a completed view, but there is no completed action, right? Remember, it has to go to the action first, and the action directs them to the view, right? So because there's no action in the first place, as far as it's concerned, that page doesn't exist. right? Just because you have view doesn't mean you have that page. You actually have to have an action for that URL to be valid. So in order to make that URL valid, I just need to add that action. So to make this whole cart work, I've got 2 checkout actions and 1 completed action. The only goal of that completed action is to just show your, hey, you've actually completed your order. That's all that is. It's just there to keep them from refreshing, causing another order to be sent. Now, one thing to notice in that process, when I went through and placed that order, when I tried to place that order, did it tell me anything about my cart being empty? Right? Isn't that kind of important that I actually have something in my cart in order to be able to check out? Right? It's important that I have something in my cart in order to check out. Okay? So let's add a check into the post version and say, okay, if it is empty, then we're going to add a model error. We're going to say, sorry, your cart is empty. Now, the order of those 2 things is important because this is changing the model state, right? And then this is checking the model state. If I do those out of order, it will still proceed even though that the cart's empty. So I need to do that. I need to check if the cart is empty before I check if the model state is valid. Yeah.
The first empty string, that's a key.
Yep. So that's the name of the field where I want to show it. Okay. So if I were to put in, let's look at shipping details real quick. If I was to put it on as name, this would now appear under the name field. Does that make sense? So, or if I were to put it as line 1, well, this error would appear under the line 1 field, right? But there's not a field that makes sense to put that error message with, right? So I'm going to put it in as empty string, which is going to say, okay, it's not really associated with a specific field. The important thing to know there, so I put this in as empty string, right? Let's look at the view. Let's look at this checkout view. So for each of these validation message for, right, it's going to show validation messages specifically for that field. What are the error messages for name? What are the error messages for line 1? What are the error messages for line 2, etc. Right? So that only shows one that go with a specific field. Okay? Validation summary, if I want to have it not associated with a field, I need to use validation summary. Okay? So if I use validation summary, it'll then show either all of the error messages there or just the ones that aren't associated with a specific property. Okay, so the way I change that, notice that that first input to validation summary is a Boolean. So if I say exclude property errors, if this is false, it'll be everything. So if there's a field that's blank, or if there's any other errors that aren't associated with that, I'll see everything. So let's just try that with false. So I'm going to go to checkout. I'm going to leave everything blank. And you can see, sorry, your cart is empty. You can see that in the error messages, as well as you can see all these, right? Now, if I were to switch that variable, switch this over to true, let's just switch that over and see what happens. Notice I only see sorry your card is empty now, right? Sorry your card is empty. Because all the rest, there are other error messages, but they're all associated with the field. So depending on what you're building, right, sometimes you may only want to see those errors there that are not part of them already associated with a field, or you may want to see all of them. One thing I would say, always put the validation summary in there, because there's a good likelihood at some point you may have ones that are not associated with the field, whatever you're doing. So I'd always recommend actually putting both of these things in here, both the validation message and the summary, for that reason. Whether you make it false or true is really a design decision, whether you show everything or just those. But I'd always recommend having that in there. Okay. So going back to the cart controller, does everybody have that code? Now, one thing you'll notice with how this is working right now, so I go to checkout right now. Does it give me any sort of indication that my cart is empty right now?
No.
Right? Right now, I don't know that my cart is empty or that that's going to be a problem. I don't know that until I fix this, and I'm probably going to go in, oh, now I need to fill out all my data. I'll probably have gone and filled in all the data and said, okay, I'm good. Oh, my cart is empty. I wish you told me that beforehand, right? So ideally, I want it to show me that error message right when I get here, not wait till I post it, right? Does that make sense? So the way I'm going to do that, well, if I didn't have this cart in the get, do I have any way of knowing whether or not the cart is empty?
No.
I don't. So that's why the get version, I would go ahead and add that, so that we can go ahead and tell the user ahead of time that there is a problem with your cart being empty before they even go to start submitting, before they even submit the form. So by doing that, they'll see the error message even if they haven't submitted the form yet. The book doesn't do that. I see that as kind of a bug, because it's helpful to know that right away rather than forcing the user to wait to submit the form to get that error message. Does that answer your question, Graham, that you had earlier?
Yeah.
So that's why I would put it in there, because we want to say, hey, is it invalid without waiting? Okay. So that's the basic structure, right? That's the basic structure. And now we'll get the thank you screen. We should get the thank you screen if I just add something to the cart and fill in the information. So I'm going to add bling bling king. I'm going to say checkout now, fill in the data, complete the order. So you should get a thanks screen like this, right? Is anybody not at this point where they're getting the thanks screen with that? Okay. Essen, where are you at?
It just says return redirect to action. It's giving me an error.
What kind of error is it giving you?
It says cannot convert the type to system.
Yeah, that needs to be an action. Yeah, this needs to be an action. And that does need to be redirect action.
That's right.
Not this one there. Don't return it, do redirect action. Do you understand why I said to do that?
Yeah, you said it.
If they refresh the page, they're still on that checkout page, so they're going to buy the items again. You don't want that. Now, can you restructure it the way I have this? I'm going to put a bunch more code in here, and it's going to be clear. It's structured that way.
Okay.
So that's what we have. So that process is working, but it's not actually doing anything yet. It's not sending out the email. It's not saving it to the database, right? So that's the part I want to put in next. Now, both of those parts can fail, right? Both sending the email potentially could go, there's a lot of things that can go wrong there as far as connecting to your SMTP server. There's a lot of things that can go wrong there. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with saving the data. So what do you think that means we need to do? What does that give us an indication that we probably need to do first before we go too far?
Push it to the bucket.
Well, that's a good thing to do as well, but more specifically, I know this process is going to fail, so I want to go ahead and put a try-catch around it. Is that what you're going to say? Right? I know this process is probably going to fail, so I want to go put a try-catch. So the place I'm going to put this try-catch, I'm going to put it around here. So I'm going to put around the redirect action. So I know something there could fail, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap a try-catch around it. And what I want to do is I want to say, let's show some sort of error view if something goes wrong. Okay. Now, more than likely you haven't created that error view yet. And even if you have, I want to kind of show you a different way to do it. So a few different details about that. So we want to say, if something goes wrong, let's show an error. To make sure we can test this right now, I'm going to go ahead and just put a throw in here so that we can see that error page. Throw new null reference exception. Right? So that gives me enough there to see, okay, I want to know what kind of exception happened, and I want to know what that message is. That's the two things I want to end up showing in that view. Okay, so I'm just going to put one line in there right now to say throw an exception. That way I can see this view as we're building and testing it. So let me go to the views folder here. The place I want to create this error view, this error view is something I can actually use for more than one controller. So typically I'm going to create this under the shared folder, right? I'm not going to create this under the cart folder. I'm actually going to create this under the shared folder so it can be reused. So I'm going to say new view, I'm going to call it error. And it looks like I might have, there, okay. So the model for this view is going to be an exception. Yep.
You made this partial?
I think I misclicked on making this partial. I didn't mean to.
Oh,
The important thing is that it's in the shared folder.
okay.
As long as it's in the shared folder, you're good. So I want to be able to show the type of the message, the type of the error, as well as I want to show the message. So let me put the type of the error in H3, and I'm going to say model.getType. GetType gives me actually the kind of class object that represents the class that it is. So getType.name will give me the name of the class that exception is. That's what that exception is. So that way I can know what type of exception it is. So at model.message. So that will give me the type and the name of the exception. Okay. So go test that real quick. You should see this come up as a null reference exception. I actually probably want to do some bootstrap in here. Class text danger. But you should see now when you check out, you should get this no reference exception.
All right. I'm getting error.
So this completed one should definitely go after, right? You check outs together. That's not the problem.
Right.
But that tells me that there's more than likely, it usually comes up when there's two and it can't disambiguate. Why don't we just add the checkout? Make sure you have the AWD get on top of that.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wait a second. Oh, here, look, you've got this checkout and you've got that checkout. Yes. You've got these. Two of them. So the logic that we're writing here, you'll need to actually put all in here, which looks like you're already.
Oh, okay.
You've got two posts.
Yeah.
Basically.
Okay, and I just confused something.
So you have to, you have two.
Okay.
So, I'll make sure it's running. Oh, you're not showing the error because you have nothing in your cart. You have nothing in your cart, but that error message isn't showing because you don't have the validation set up. So go back to the checkout view and you add in that. Add in those validations.
So that'll keep you.
No.
So add it in after that. Add it in up here after that line. Because it's not telling you the shopping cart. That's your problem. So push that down the line. Which is what it did. It doesn't use the same color. Same color.
Okay.
So we're using text box, not text box 4.
Oh.
Yeah. So. I would recommend going back to the long form computational form checkout. But
Is that? See, I had it clear because we were gonna end up changing the.
Oh, really?
it's good enough. I guess just get rid of it.
Okay.
See what that's mean run that. You just get it. If you got it to the point where it crashes because you use an old reference exception, please get that up on your screen so I can see that everybody's in some place.
You want me to, go around out, putting anything in there?
It should tell you the shopping cart is empty right now. So check out now. See, it says your shopping cart is empty. So I want you to put her. But I need the error of you actually putting something in there and go through it. So you have items in your cart, right? That's something in your cart. This here's what we're gonna do. So add something in the cart. That's where we're gonna do something. We'll just say, okay, stay there, Eston. Where are you at?
I just added validation.
Oh, okay.
I gotta do the summary on top. So right under this.
Okay. So, just because a few people are having that,
Yeah, take a peek at
I'm
that.
gonna pull up this.
Thank you.
So I did think, I mean, I think the way the book had it, it just had the validation summary. You'll notice that I have text box. I have the validation message form with each of those. The book does give you sort of a, here's the whole long version and then shortens it down.
Yeah.
Please don't use that shortened version. Please don't use the shortened version that uses a loop. Please use the long version. You'll have less issues with it.
Come up with 4 each underneath the address.
Yeah, please don't use the for each version. You can get it to work, but the issue there is it doesn't really survive all that well as you start making changes. It's a lot. There is some value having it all spelled out.
Can you explain the field set? So do you have the field sets around each form?
Yeah, I have some. Well, no, I have field sets not grouped it. I can show you how I grouped it, but it's by I grouped the name, the address, and the bottom part. I've got 3 field set groups. That's not required to make this work.
So we should not have 4 each.
If you do, just leave it in. We can make it work. We want to add in
Is that what we're gonna see out of the book?
well, if you looked in the book, it told you here's a long form, and you immediately replace it with on the next page. Replace it with this.
Short. We need the longer.
You do want the longer version. You don't need it right now. So go ahead and just put in there. You're going to do HTML.validation message. And it's going to be just validation message, not validation message form. So the first argument is going to be property, similar to how it is up here. Let's see what it gives you. So the HTML attributes, you want to say new, and give it tell it that the class is so new, no, just new, code. On this object, it says.
So
It just needs that on this object. Just like you've got up here, you see classes, yada yada. So that'll fix. So go ahead and try it. And you want a validation message for so if you hit complete order now, there. So it's giving you errors. Where are you at? Can I see this?
It's basically the same as.
So should I be in that exception?
So that's all good. So now you need to fill in. Oh, you need to add something to your cart and then fill out the information.
I haven't added the try catch in here
Yeah. So that's where I want to do.
He said just to try to match their own exception and then create that field there. And that try catch fields card control.
Don't worry about
That you just throw an exception
Yeah.
and then bring up a view.
Or
Give us that the other one.
actually under validation underneath this validation
Should be
message.
message one. Remember, anytime you put labeling, you need to put the for attribute on there. I think you left it out, but you need to put it in there. So label for yada yada.
Shift to
Overhead. If you want this. You see you've got one. That needs to be the word usage for text entry. This CSS.
So how is this? Oh, and cache, okay, done.
So, let's go to two changes. So I want to actually move a few things around.
Okay.
So let's rename this one as utils.
So I'm good to fill stuff out.
And then we're actually going to just put both these things in. So, go to the park model finder, page copper, into here. Remove this, so they're both just SportsStore. I can move it. So you just need to get some details.
check out the
So this 4, which is 1.0.
Leave it for now.
But I did, I commented out.
Oh, you have all the long versions, just bring the long version back.
Okay.
Oh, actually, just leave it for now. Just leave it for now. This is not the important part I'm trying to look at.
Yeah, I did both.
The one thing you're missing here, you see you don't have any sort of validation message, right? So add HTML dot validation message. Not for or no, just as regular. They work differently. So in this case, we won't actually use it. So it's going to be property dot form. So text box 4, validation message 4, they use that lambda. The ones without the word for actually use a string as that first argument. So the second argument is going to say new class. So in there it's going to be property name. Just say, yeah. You don't have to.
I don't need just new class.
It's just going to be new.
Oh, you gotta pass the exception.
But just the future, I would want you to write that all out. I mean, because he did that for you too. I'd rather not.
Okay. I can come back later to it and try to fit it back in.
It's not so much that you're not missing something, it's more like, hey, maybe we will come along.
Down the road.
It's just put all the pieces in there.
Okay.
Okay, so where I wanted everybody to be at, I think most of everybody's there. I know some people are still working on sorting out some issues. Go to checkout. So I'm going to add something to the cart. I'm going to say checkout. Fill in that. form, say complete order. So this is what you should be seeing here. And this is just a way of saying, hey, we want to test this first to make sure that error view works before we start getting all the database stuff in, to make sure that we can see what went wrong. Because high loop chance, working with database, there's a high chance that something will go wrong along the way. Don't feel bad if it does. Something probably will. There's just a lot of ducks that you have to get in line for everything to work. So the other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to make a little enhancement before we code too far with this, simply for the reason, oftentimes when we get errors from Entity Framework, oftentimes the error message will be see inner exception for details, and it won't actually tell us anything about what went wrong. So if we leave this as is, well, it won't necessarily be as helpful. So the way around that, I'm going to actually throw this whole thing into a loop. Let me fix that real quick. Like so. So I'm going to say start with the exception being the model and go as long as we have an exception. My step here, notice this is my iteration step, I'm not saying sort of plus plus. What I'm doing is stepping into those inner exceptions. So I'm saying, if there's an exception, give me that one.
Is that like, is that what an aggregate exception is, when there are multiple thrown back?
Not really. What happens is, oftentimes there's a lower level SQL exception, which gets wrapped up in another exception, which gets wrapped up in another exception. And in the process of wrapping, they don't copy the message. They just say, see the inner exception. So
Okay.
oftentimes the actual information about what went wrong is at that lowest level, the very inner exception. So what you're gonna see when things actually go wrong is you're gonna see 2 or 3 error messages here. And you should see, as it is right now, there's no inner exception, so you should still just see one entry. You should just see the no reference exception. So that's going to make it easier for us to debug errors as they occur. Whatever the source of them may be.
On the error.
Okay, so that's taken care of. So now we can go back to the cart controller and actually do the stuff we need to do. So in the cart controller, I'm going to this post version of the checkout method. Okay. And what I want to do in this try is actually make it do the process of making that order. So there's 3 steps to that order. So the first step to that order is we need to save it to the database. I need to, I need to send the email. And then finally, I need to clear the cart. Once you've ordered it, I can take everything out of the cart. Okay? Now, there's a question here. So I need to do these 2 things. Save the email, save the data, save the order, and I need to send the email, right? The order that I do those things doesn't matter. Does it matter which order I do those things in?
Probably.
Yes.
I mean, you might
Okay.
want to save the order before clearing the cart.
Well, I definitely want to do the clearing the cart last, for sure, because otherwise I'd have problems on both fronts. Let's say I sent the email first, right? And then I saved the order, okay?
So yeah, because if you sent the email and it was fine, but something happened and saving it to the database.
Right. Right. So if I send the email out just fine, the user gets the email saying that their items got ordered, and then we fail to save it to the database, do you think they're ever going to get their order? Probably not. Okay. So we want to make sure we save the data first before sending the email out. Okay. That's going to avoid a lot of issues. That doesn't fix everything, but that means that, well, it's more important that we save the data than it is that we sent the email, right? If things go wrong with sending the email, well, maybe we can send it again at some later date. But if I don't get it saved to the database, we've lost that order. So I need to make sure I save it first, okay? So what I'm going to put in here, let's start with the sending email, because you probably have some code for that. So I'm going to say await send order email. And I want to pass in the cart and the shipping info. Now, you'll see a bunch of errors on there I have up there. Obviously, we need to do some more to make that work. So the idea is I have enough logic there. I want to have that in a separate method. Okay, so I'm going to call that method send order email. You will notice I'm doing await because ideally we want that process to be asynchronous. Ideally, we want that process to be asynchronous. Now, in order to use the await word in this method, isn't there something I have to do?
You gotta import it or something?
In the method header for send order email, you have to define it as asynchronous.
Right, so we need to define it as async. We can use the async keyword. Is there anything else we need to do to the method header?
It needs to return a task.
It needs to return a task. Specifically, I'm going to say task action result. So we're going to say async task action result. Now, it is going to complain there about a using. Okay, so here I need to say using system threading tasks. You bring that in. So at least that's going to fix the problem with there being that await keyword there. Okay. So now I want to go and add that method. I'm going to go all the way to the end, add it in here. It's going to be private because I don't want that to be an actual endpoint that users can go to. I don't want them to be able to go to cart/send order email. So I want to make sure that that's private because this is just a helper method. It's not an actual action that they can go to. Now here it's just going to be task because otherwise it would be void. I would say if it wasn't async, I would just make this void. In that case, you just say task. Okay. So, sending the email. We've already kind of covered how to send email. Do you remember where we covered that originally? Party invites, okay? So if I pull up my code for party invites, I can kind of extract what we had there. We'll notice that there's a few things that don't work, but let me start there. So if I pull up party invites, so notice a few things first of all. Okay, so this takes a guest response object. So that was our model here, right? What is our model in where we're coming to? It's shipping info, right? Shipping info is basically our model there. Okay, so we're going to have to change a few things, right? We know we've already put that check in there. We've already checked that things are valid. What I need, though, is this try-catch portion. And in fact, I've already put try-catch in, right? Earlier? I already put a try-catch in there, so I'm not actually going to bring a duplicate copy over that. I'm just going to bring this part. Notice I'm also not bringing in the part that returns the view, because we're going to do that differently on this side. So all I'm bringing in is that using SMTP client. That's all I have there. Okay. We'll notice that there's some usings that are off, so I need using systemnet mail, and I need using systemnet. Okay. So I've got create the SMTP client, grab the environment variables, set up the connection details, create the message. Now you'll notice in here there's some stuff we need to change, right? So obviously we want to change the subject line of this email, and we want to change the body of that email, right? So if I were to say change it here, new order submitted, start with that, right? I'm going to have an email that comes through, but it's always going to say new order submitted. It's not going to have any information about the order that was actually filed, right? So ideally, I want to put all of the information that from the user's order into the body of the email. Does that make sense? But this should be enough to actually get the email to send. Okay? So how do we want to build up the body?
I believe it said do it according to a certain page in the book.
I said 246. So if you look at 246, you can kind of see the code from the book. I am going to tweak it a little bit because if you try to actually look at how that email sends, it's kind of ugly, and it's not using any HTML formatting. So I do want to show you how to put some HTML formatting into the body of your emails because it's a very helpful tool. Now, in order to put HTML formatting into there, there's one thing you have to add. We have to set the message here, message is body HTML, to true. Otherwise, it will treat it as plain text. Okay, it'll just treat these, it won't actually render the tags that we put in here as HTML tags if we don't set that. Okay. So looking at 246, when it builds that body, what does it use? What does it use?
String builder.
It uses string builder, right? Okay. So what's the benefit? What is the reason that it uses string builder? Essen? What is the reason it uses string builder?
So I can append to the email?
Well, not entirely. That's semi-related. I mean, couldn't I just do this and start adding things together using a string and plus equals? I could. I mean, I could make that work. What's the benefit of using a string builder over this concatenation? Well, I'm doing append.
He has like a for each loop, and he's like also using some formatting tools. Can you not do that just by adding it to a basic string?
Doesn't concatenation that way use a bit more resources because it has to combine arrays?
Right?
It's building a string over and over again.
So if I say, well, let me put one more line in there just to accentuate the point. So body plus equal right? If I write it this way, it will work, right? But don't get me wrong, it will work. And if it was as simple as this, you wouldn't see any performance difference. But when you're building out emails, it's never as simple as that. And emails can easily get pretty long because of all the formatting that goes in there once you start putting marketing in the mix. So if I run this code as is, right? So I've got a variable called body first, initially, right? And it's got effectively an array in there. It's got an array that's got how long is that array? Well, it's 4, right? It's a length of 4 because it's got 4 characters in there, right? So initially, I've got this array looks like that, right? And then I go create a new one. Well, I have to remember I can't change the size of an array. I can't change the size of an array. So if I want to have a bigger array, I have to throw that one away and create a new one, right? So second line, I get down here, I create a bigger array, which judging there, I say, how many characters do I need? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I need another 8 characters, right? So I create another array that's size 12, copy over the first characters, and then add in the other ones, right? Go to the second line. Okay, now I need a bigger array. Throw that one away, create a new one, right? So if I do concatenation, every time I add a new thing on there, I have to create a brand new array that's just a little bit bigger and throw the other one away. Once you start getting into, hey, this string might be a few million characters long, right? Or even a few thousand characters long, I hope that you can recognize throwing that away, creating a new one, throwing that away, keeping a new one, costs you something. In fact, there's another hidden cost in there in the sense that every time you create an array in C#, it also has to go through the array and set everything to 0. So it'll say, give me the space, set it all to 0, then copy in and copy in. So you're paying that cost every time I do plus equals, right? You're paying the cost every time I do plus equals. And every time I do plus equals, that cost keeps adding up as the string gets longer, right? Okay, so how does string builder fix that? Well, string builder internally deals with that array a little bit better, okay? So what it says is, I'll start by allocating X amount, right? So we'll start that string builder, we'll start it as empty, right? So initially I create the string builder, empty array, nothing there. I add in the first thing. Okay, so we do have to expand it here. But I don't necessarily expand it just to hold the text that you gave me, right? So at this point, I'm going to create an array that maybe can hold 8 things. But keep track of how much of that array I'm actually using. That makes sense, how many characters are actually in there. Once we go across that, we'll say, oh, well, let's double it. We run out of space, we double it. So what that means is there's a lot fewer times, because it's doubling it. Every time it runs out of space, it doubles the amount of space that's there. it means that you're creating new arrays less. Does that make sense? So rather than every character you add means you have to create a new array, it means, well, only when you run out of space do you have to create a new array. That makes sense? So that's where that makes this a little bit more efficient. It's going to use less memory, and it's going to take less time to actually build the email because we're using a string builder. Semantically, it looks very, very similar to plus equals. But performance-wise, it's very different. That's what you need to know. It's not about the semantics, it's about the performance.
I forgot what the actual term is, but the $sign quotations, what's that called again?
The template syntax.
Yeah. Is that better? I mean, because you can just like put it on new lines and it looks pretty similar.
But I can't necessarily, I still have a problem that I need to at some point do a loop, right? So I can't, I will use, the thing is I want to use both. So I'm going to use the template syntax and the string builder. I want to actually use both. The template syntax, what it does, it makes it easier to do the string formatting. Gives a different syntax for that. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't help me with performance problems.
Yeah.
Okay.
The reason I ask is because like when we're writing an email like this where we have a general idea of the amount of additions we need to make to the string, we can kind of forego that operation. Thing.
Not in the real world. So where I'm going to start is I'm going to start by first creating that string builder. I need using system text. So I'm going to say body append line. Now the difference here between what was in the book and what's here is I'm just putting an H1 tag around that to make that a header. Which with flipping this over, saying the body is HTML, that's really all you have to do. As long as you switch that to true, now everything here is treated as HTML. The important thing to know, however, remember in HTML that white spaces collapse to one space. So putting things append line, these are going to put line endings in there. Those are completely ignored once you go over to HTML, right? So line terminators, those are completely ignored once you go over to HTML, which often means you have to add some more tags to get things on lines you want them to. Okay. The next piece I'm going to add in here is to say, okay, append the items header. I'm going to put that in with an H2. And here you can see I'm using that template string in the middle there. So for each product, I'm adding in line quantity, line product name, and giving them the price each. I know the book went through and was calculating subtotals for each of these, quote unquote. I don't know that looking at the receipt that's all that helpful. I think it's more helpful to have the unit price there on a receipt. But that's a subjective kind of. That's because we moved it, remember we moved it to just the SportsStore namespace. It's already in the SportsStore namespace, so it should already be able to find it. You have to implement the interface. Okay. It needs to be find out. That should be good. He was saying that that's not a, he was telling you it wasn't a dynamic interface. Do you quick go to edit and advance format the document? That's okay. This should be task, not task.
So I have what you wrote up here, the primary thing. I guess I was just trying to tell the difference between this is what I'm getting for.
So, rename it can you rename the method to what we have? So this would be send over an email instead. So that's the signature that I used, right? That just means you need to change the signature. We started on the right track, but we just want to choose the signature. You thought of process, right?
Yeah.
So I called it something else. The reason I'm calling it that, see, this doesn't tell me what process this is doing. Versus this tells me that it's in So then you should be able to go from.
Should I make But, okay, so my for each looks a little different, but it's essentially what's going on.
Yeah.
You want me to change?
You change it. That's what I'm asking for right now. Sure, I'm going to change it since.
Where are those difference? Where are those difference?
Are you coming along?
Yeah.
Where's the code that we were looking at? I don't see it there.
Sorry, yeah, I scrolled up.
Okay. I would, just because, hey, you've allocated the resource already here. I wouldn't want to allocate the client until we know, hey, everything's there. So I would actually take this. Does it make a lot of difference? Not necessarily, but I would say it's probably better to move it up top. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Just because if something's up here, then we're not going through here and we have a sickly client, or anything like that.
Makes it a little easier to read as we get down to the bottom where we're actually. Okay.
Just trying to keep things separate.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can do it both places, it depends on what you're building, where it's gonna make sense.
That's what I had to go through.
Just want to throw it up that way.
Yeah.
That way we're on the same.
Yeah, I get it, for sure.
So there's the items. The last piece in there, I'm going to throw this up, but hold up a second before you start making changes with this bit. So with the shipping info, okay, one piece of advice there, you'll notice in the book, it'll say body.append, it'll say append, line 2, question mark, empty space, right? Well, what that's going to do is say if there is no line 2, if the user hasn't entered a value for line 2, then use the empty string, right? Well, if you leave that, if you take that as is, what that's going to mean is you have an empty line in the email, which honestly doesn't look that great. So what I would recommend instead, and this is just making the email look nicer, wrap that in an if statement instead. So that if statement's going to say, if the line isn't there, then don't give me an empty line. Does that make sense? I'm putting break rows at the end of each of these just for simplicity's sake. To try and get these on different lines. So the only difference between this and the book is basically going to mean that, hey, the ones that are the values that you didn't enter, that means they don't show up as empty lines in the email.
You wouldn't need them for city, state, and country, right? Because aren't they required anyway?
Depends on how you implement it. Some of those aren't required. Here's the thing. The biggest reason why I would go ahead and put it around all of them is if for some reason you need to change the rules about what's required on the front end, right? This shouldn't really have anything to do with the front end rules about what's required or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Here I just want to put everything that was, if it was entered, then show it. If it's not entered, then don't show it. Because otherwise, if I put checks on some of these and checks on not, now it's connected with whatever the logic on the front end is. And so if that changes, that breaks this.
Right.
I don't want that connection. That makes for brittle code. So I think it makes more sense to check all of the things rather than being picky choosy.
Separations of concern.
Yeah. I don't want what I have on the UI to affect what I do in the email.
I've heard emails use old HTML. Is that true?
What do you mean, old HTML?
Like they use like the old version HTML, or is that?
It really depends. It really strongly depends on what email provider you're working with. What you can usually rely on is HTML4 stuff usually works. Mostly HTML4 stuff works. What you can't rely on is JavaScript or CSS working oftentimes. Because some email clients will prevent that stuff from going through for security reasons. So that's where the only tags I'm using in here are H1, H2, and BR, because those are long-standing tags and they should be well supported regardless of what you're using for your email. That's right. But where this looks. No, it's not. You'd be right on the front. probably still using, if you took it out of the book has some Bootstrap 3 stuff in there. So, for instance, panel, things like that, those are Bootstrap 3 constructs. They don't apply so well to Bootstrap 4. Let's go look at real quick. I see your put in the app. Okay, you did use the tabs that I used. So then go back to your layout. So what you want to do instead here, wrap those categories in just a nav.
Okay.
Get rid of that tag entirely. And just put the menu inside. And then change this to main. So you should just have nav, main. So this should be a nav as well. And here in the classes, so you're going to keep navbar. Navbar inverse is a Bootstrap 3 thing. The one that exists in Bootstrap 4 is navbar dark. And then you need to do BG dark as well.
In this one?
No, no, no. So that's what's in place. So navbar inverse was Bootstrap 3. The equivalent to that in Bootstrap 4 is navbar dark.
That's a lot better.
So there's some of those things like that you just have to know to converge Bootstrap 4 because they won't work. If you watch the videos of things I did, I think I covered most of those things.
Okay.
So if you would, that should be everything to send the email. Can everybody go through and actually get that fill that form out, get that email sent, show me what you have, show me that in your actual email inbox, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page there. Hit continue and make sure you're running the latest code. And make sure you add something with first.
Okay, I got a compilation error.
You got invalid HTML. Okay, near view. So go to the checkout view.
Oh, you didn't set the button.
I think it goes for 800 lines, so.
But you can see this in the end,
Oh, with the field
there's a mismatch with your tags. So like you're opening a field set, you're opening a field set here, I bet you're never closing it. There it is.
Yeah.
And you got it. Now try it, that should fix it. You just had some straight throughs. Okay, so check your email.
Yeah, just got it.
Your breadcrumbs are not the right ones, but you see these are on the same line.
Oh, shoot, yeah.
Your items are on the same line, so something's not quite there.
That makes sense.
The ones for the spam emails, the random signups.
So you can see now the email size and formatted. It looks good.
It's better. Yeah.
What did I used to do?
It looks like you have some
What was it?
and tag search and slash. Slashes. 704. The slash at the end means it's an empty tag. The slash at the beginning means it's a. Without using the word on it. You're all good. Looks good.
What?
Could be wrong, huh?
Right.
Get to do that is HTML.
Body. This needs to be the body of that picture.
It's an HTML body.
So dark. Oh, I did that.
I didn't like it.
Oh yeah, that's how it works.
Every other
Some of these things are what I'm trying to show you is maybe some
Yeah, and the if on there.
Oh, I forgot. I wanted all of that midnight.
Right.
Divinity. See, I wasn't gonna go with myself. I'm gonna go with that one. Yeah, just well, I mean, like, how much is the price for like? I don't know. I'm gonna go with acrylic just to make it. It's definitely cheaper than acrylic.
Okay.
The acrylic will be thinner as well. You got that. You got that. Sorry, we did this again. Okay, good. Yeah. I actually put B3 instead of BR. Fat fingered it, you know?
That would do it. Yeah, that would do it.
That's close. You can set it off too.
What validation was that you did?
Yeah, if you go to your environment variables, you can see which one it is. So just go ahead and look under here.
Name, address.
And you use so that's what you want to log in this. So you cancel on that. And go check, is that the email that you're in?
Maybe it's the browser. Are you using Chrome?
Yeah.
You'll get more.
What's better? I mean,
Wait, you get extra air. Yeah. Like where is it?
So yours didn't go through. Well, let's track that down on your although, oh, maybe.
Oh, this is LastPass. we can call it like past days, we can call it here. You can do this.
We'll take a look at it after a while. But it looks like all your code's good, so.
We can check.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take a break, come back at 2:15, and we'll get to the data.
Why?
You can literally access everything in your email. If someone like ever hacked your email, they're gonna be able to get all your passwords.
That's your reason. Yeah, I mean, I never say my stuff anyway.
Okay, so at that point, I think most of you started, had a lot of what we kind of went over so far, because a lot of that was in the book. But I want to make sure everybody was kind of in the same place that I'm at for the next piece, because it helps. It helps to be in the same place at this point. So, what I want to do, we fleshed out this part. We're sending the email now, but I need to save this to the database still. Okay. So, remember what we need to do first if we want to start putting stuff in the database. What's the first step of that process? Jeremy.
Go to the project.database, SportsStore.database.
Okay, and do what? Yeah, that's a good start.
Yeah.
Create a table on the SQL Server Management thing.
So I'm gonna actually start here. I'm gonna go to the tables folder. I'm gonna add a new table. Okay, I want to store more data, so therefore I need another table. So I'm gonna right click on tables and I'm gonna say add. I'm gonna say add a new table. I'm gonna call that table orders. Okay. Let me grab the schema for that. I'm going to hit T-SQL to expand that, so I just have that part open. Okay. So we think about that. Orders, well, they have to have some sort of primary key. I'm going to make that an identity column. I'm going to use that as my primary key. I'm going to have the date it was ordered and the date it was shipped. Right? That's a good starting off point for the data I need to save. Now, you may note that there's some important information missing on this table, right?
Is it the shipping information?
Shipping information is missing, right? So we will want to come back and put that in. I'm actually going to end up putting that in as a separate table. But notice the shipping information is actually missing. I don't know if this is all I have, I don't know the address to ship it to. Okay, but let's start with this. So I've got the order ID, I've got the ship order date, I've got the ship date. So that'll give me, okay, now I can track the order and when it was ordered. But I also need some other information in there as well. I need the shipping information. What else am I missing?
The items.
Right. I don't know which products they ordered, right? And I don't know how many of them they ordered. So I need another table to track that. So I'm going to go back to the tables folder and I'm going to add another table, call it order lines. Now, if you did have the schema in from if you did have the schema from the handout on Friday, lab handout, this line was actually wrong. The last line in this was wrong on the handout. Both of those said order ID. It should have been foreign key order ID and foreign key product ID.
So, remind me, what is the DBO, like when you automatically create a table, what is the DBO for?
So DBO is the name of the schema. SQL Server actually lets you build, sorry, SQL Server lets you build databases that have more than one schema. Schemas are a way to kind of group tables together, but pretty much everybody just puts it all in DBO, which is the default. It's very rare that people actually split a database into multiple schemas. Again, it's something that SQL Server supports. It's very rarely something that's used, but that's what that's there for. Give everybody a chance to type that in, but you should notice already that there are a few things here that are new. And I'll go through those as soon as everybody's got it typed out. This is foreign key, not primary key. There's still a comma there.
I'm getting an error on references. It says incorrect syntax.
You need to not have you need parentheses after order ID. Sure. I'm sorry. No, not there. Here. So let's kind of look at this from top to bottom. So the first piece we know here, okay, so I've got the order ID. I need that obviously if I want to know which order does this go with. I need to know the order ID. I need the product ID to know which product you're ordering. Both of those, if we look at orders, well, it's an int here. If I look at the products table, it's an int here, right? So I need to, as I'm building this table out, I need to follow those same data types that I've used elsewhere, right? So I've used an integer here for the product ID, and used an integer here for order ID. Okay. If I use big int or some other type there, I need to make sure I'm using the same type everywhere. Does that make sense? Because I'm linking now between more than one table. When I'm linking more than one table, I need to follow that. Okay, quantity is an integer, price per decimal, price per unit is a decimal 16.2. Where have we seen that decimal 16.2 as well?
When we use decimal in that first table.
On the first table, right? When we put in the price for the products, I put it in as decimal 16.2. So I want to follow that same convention because I'm actually going to be copying from that column over to this column. That price per unit is the price of the product. You got a hand up, Alex?
I was going to say the same thing.
Okay. So yeah, so we're pulling from those other tables. That's why I'm using those types. Okay. Now, notice that there's something very interesting happening here. Primary key, order ID, product ID. Okay. Primary key, order ID, product ID. Let's go back and look at orders. How did I define the primary key? I defined it here in line. I defined the order ID is the primary key, right? I define the order ID as the primary key, and it's also the identity column, so it's going to automatically get assigned a number, right? So this is fine as long as I want the primary key to just be one column. Okay, and I don't want to get. It also doesn't let me. The other thing is it doesn't let me give a primary key anyway. But as long as it's only one column, that's okay. Okay. So just a refresher. What is a primary key? What's that about? Why do we need it? What is it used for?
Is that for that table a unique number so you can like identify it?
Okay.
Pull out each line uniquely.
Graham?
That's exactly what I was saying.
Okay. So the primary key doesn't have to be a number. Okay. It can actually be anything. The primary key is but it is a way to uniquely identify the row. So every table needs to have a primary key, and that primary key needs to be mandatory and unique for every row in that table. So you can't leave a blank, and it has to have a different value for every row. Okay? Now, let's look at order lines. So order lines, I could give it another column, call it order line ID, right? I could give it another column, call it order line ID, make that primary key identity, and be done with that, right? So I could do that. What I'm using here is what's called a composite key. I'm taking two columns and putting them together and making them the primary key, okay? The reason that this is safe, the reason this works out, and there is some benefit to this, so I'm saying the order ID plus the product you're ordering, that's enough to uniquely identify the row. Does that make sense? That's enough to uniquely identify the row. If I just took the product ID, right, is that enough to uniquely identify the row?
No,
Why not?
because there are multiple orders that could have the same product in them.
Right. Multiple people could order a kayak, or I could order a kayak on more than one time, right? I could order a kayak today and a kayak tomorrow. So the product ID is not unique within this table, okay? Because all of those reasons. What about the order ID? Would the order ID be enough to be unique? Why not, Scott?
And no.
Heston, why not?
Well, because the same person could order multiple times, or I guess the same person could have the same order ID.
If I put in another order, I get another order ID. So my first order is 1, my second one is 2, my third one is 3.
There could be multiple orders that have the same things in them.
No.
What's the products?
So let's.
Not necessarily.
So I've got my order ID. And I've got my product ID. One. This is, well, I'm just gonna make this 3. Order 3, order 3, product 5, product 7. Is that valid?
Yes,
Why?
Oh, yes.
because this is all, it's like this table is recording all of the different types of products and their quantity per order.
Per order. What are you saying to say, Evan?
I was gonna say it's valid because the primary key is the combination of the two.
That's why I'm getting to why I'm picking that, yeah. So if I have this data in the table, what I'm saying is for order 3, I want product 5 and I want product 7. I have more than one product on that order. That makes sense? If I just made the order ID the primary key, then you could only order one product in your order. That's it. All your orders would have to be consisting of just one product, right? Or if I just made the product ID the primary key, then nobody else can order a kayak once one person has ordered a kayak, right? So the reason I need that is to allow all those things. But given an order ID, given a product, that's unique enough. Now that does mean that one particular thing is not valid. So I can't say this. I can't say, I want product 5, I want product 7, and then I want product 7 again. Right? That prevents this case. Because really what I want them to do is instead have the quantity here and say, I want one of these and 2 of those. Remove that one. Does that make sense? So what I'm trying to prevent is multiple entries of that same product on your order. If I just used an identity column, that would not prevent this. That would allow this to happen. Okay, that would allow you to have the same product on your order more than one time. Okay, so that's one reason I'm doing it. The other is I can get some performance out of it because of how you're kind of accessing the data, if that makes sense. So I can get, there are some performance benefits that I can get out of it if I deal with this table correctly.
So I'm just trying to understand the schema of the communication between the order lines and the order table. So the order table, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead.
Right. So the order represents a whole order, right? This is the data that's specific to an order.
Right. And then that order ID is going to reference however many times it's found in the order lines table.
Right. So if I've got 3 different products I'm ordering, I'm going to have 3 order lines, but still only one order, right? Every order, there's only one order row, but the number of order lines, rows, varies from order to order. This is how I get an array. This is what lets me get around the fact that I can only put singular values into a database. This allows me to have an array of order lines. Does that make sense? I'm basically storing that array of order lines in the order lines table. That makes sense? So this is where we get into now what we call relational databases, because there is a relationship now between the order ID in this table and the order ID here, right? Between these two tables, that order ID has to match up, right? If I've got order line, let's say I have this line that says, I want, for order 5, I want 10 products, I want product 10, I want 3 of them. Well, what happens if there's no order 5? That's a problem, isn't it? If I have this order line says, oh, I want something for order 5, but there's no order 5, I've got an inconsistency in my data, right? So what I want to enforce is that if you put an order line in, well, this order ID has to be valid. There has to be an order that matches up with. Similar thing with the product ID. I don't want you to be able to put product ID 10 if there's no product 10. That makes sense? So to make sure both of these things are valid and match up with a row in another table. Okay, so this is why I'm specifying that they are now foreign keys. That's what this does. This says foreign key. So syntax here says the order ID column here, that one, references the order ID column in the orders table. Those have to be connected. Okay, if for some reason I delete the order, I also have to delete the order lines. Okay, I can't create an order line without an order. They have to be connected. So that enforces that relationship between the two. Similar thing with the product ID. I'm saying the product ID in this table has to match up with the product ID column in the products table. That makes sense? So that's enforcing that relationship. If I leave that out, you can put, if you leave out these two foreign keys, I can put any data I want into the order lines table. And it has no validity check. Does that make sense? So this is making sure that the data is valid. Okay. You do need to know that there is a performance cost to that, because anytime I now go insert data or update or modify the data in that row, it has to now check, are those IDs valid? It has to go do a lookup and make sure that those are valid. That does cost us something. Okay. Don't underestimate the value of that. That does cost us something, but that is very helpful to have those links. Questions about foreign keys? So you've got primary keys, which again is this row, that determines what row in how this row in the table is unique, right? How you access it. Versus foreign key says this is referring to other tables. So creating a link to other tables. Okay? That makes sense?
What would happen if we didn't have those foreign keys?
So if I didn't have those foreign keys, I can put, if I didn't have that foreign key, I can put in whatever order ID I want. It doesn't have to be valid. I could put in order ID 5 million in here, and it won't check that there's a valid, if that's valid. Does that make sense? It's checking that there's a connection there, that there is an order with that number. Similar thing, if I didn't put that in there and I delete order 5, it won't tell me that there's a problem because now there's an order, this order line lingering around that doesn't connect to an order anymore. That makes sense? So it'll give me an error if I try to delete the order as well. Similar thing, if I try to delete the product, it'll say you can't delete the product because somebody ordered it. Okay, so that's what that's about. Okay, so we've created these two tables. Is there something we need to do next? We've created the schema for them, right? But let's say I go look at Management Studio. I'm going to go look at the database right now. And let's see what's there. So I still only have a products table, right? I've created these two tables. I've created the orders table and the order lines table, but they aren't actually there in the database yet, right? What do I need to do to get them to the database?
You have to publish them.
I have to publish them. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that, we already have a publish script that we configured here. We don't want to configure that again. We're just going to expand the publish folder. I'm going to double click on this localhost script. Double clicking on it is going to bring this dialog up here. And you can see that I've already got my connection details there. I don't have to type them in again. If I were to right click on the project and say publish, you see the values are still blank, right? So if I right click on the project and say publish, these will still be blank. So I want to, we saved those details earlier. I'm going to reuse them. So I'm going to open this up. I'm going to say generate script. It's going to give me a little script here. If I look through it here, it's creating the order lines table, creating the orders table, as I would expect, and it's doing some additional stuff there. Okay. So I'm going to tell the script to execute. It's going to pop up. It's green, no issues found. That's it. So if I look at it in Management Studio again, let me just refresh here. We can see that we now have those three tables. Now one thing I saw in there and I forgot to mention earlier, on the orders table, do you see this default clause? So default says if you don't give this a value when you're creating a row in SQL, then automatically use this value instead. So I'm saying by default use the current date. Get date returns the current date. So if you don't specify a value for the order date, then we'll just assume that it's the current date. That's just a quick safety precaution. Okay. So we've created the table. We've published them. What do we need to do next? How does this all connect? How do we connect our database to our application?
You have to create models that trying to think of the right word for this, that like reflect the columns of the table.
Right. So I've created an orders table, right? So what class do I need to create? I need to create an order class, right? And I'm going to put that in the models folder because it's a model. So I'm going to go back up to this project. I'm going to right click on models. I'm going to say add new class. We're going to create an order class. Now, useful word of advice, you can hold the tabs and drag them, stick them like this, because usually it's worth having both the model and the schema up at the same time so that you can make sure that you're kind of reflecting each other. I'm actually going to stick them up vertically because of space constraints. Yep.
I'm in an error. I can't execute it. That's good.
What's the error?
It just says an error was encountered. That's all it says.
I'll come over there in a minute. So I need to have these reflect each other, so I need to add a order ID column. So I'm going to add order ID. I'm going to add the order date, and I'm going to add the ship date. So that's where I'm going to start with my Model D. So double click on this. It says rows were detected. Then go back to messages. double click on it, it should detect it. Okay. So it says products order, it's saying photo is being dropped. Why is your photo column being dropped?
I have no idea.
It looks like when you added it, you probably added it over here.
I did,
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
Okay.
So you probably went in here and changed it. Yeah, so don't do that in the future.
Okay.
Because you'll run into this problem here. What you want to do is you want to actually change it here in the schema because we're going to need it.
Oh, so then update that, okay.
Right, so it's trying to remove that photo column because you never.
Okay. Bar chart.
We'll look at what it is already.
No, we're using a new model.
You can see we upgraded it as.
The new model is reflecting the database.
But yeah, if you don't update the schema here, then it's only locally on your computer. And if like some other developer tries to pull it, you
Whenever
don't
you
have
create
that column.
the image,
Right?
and you publish it,
Yeah, when you do it here.
Okay. So on there, date time. It's probably not a data type that you've touched too much yet, but it is basically what it says on the box. It's a way to store a date and a time in a variable. It is actually a value type. It's a struct. It may look like with the kind of type syntax here that it says it's a date time. It looks like a class name, right? Okay. It's actually a struct, which means that when you're working with these date times, it's going to be passed by value. This is the other reason why we have to put the nullable on here, because it's a struct. They don't normally aren't allowed to be null. Like classes are allowed to be null, structs are not. So that's why we need the question mark there. If we don't put the question mark there, it's going to assume that that time is 0. Under certain circumstances, it's going to default that time to 0, which is not going to be the time that you really want it to be. And so, if you see something showing up as like 1970, January 1st, 1970, there's a good chance that one of your date times at some point was not set. So that's initially that setup there. What attributes do we need to add now to this? There's some attributes that we need to add.
The order date is required.
The order date is required. Yep.
Primary key or something?
Yeah, we do need to specify which one is the key, and we do need to specify that one of them is required. So the order ID is the key. The order date is required, and you can see the ship date is optional. Ship date is optional because we don't know it at the time the order is placed, right? We don't know what the ship date's going to be until later. We know the order date immediately when they place the order, but we don't know the ship date until later. Okay. One thing that was mentioned at some point in the middle of your book, remember it mentioned the display attribute? So the display attribute is one of those things that's going to get used sometimes to give a meaningful name to that property that's going to show up in the UI. So in this case, I would often put it in as such, order space date. Because otherwise it's going to show it exactly as the name of the property. So that's a common thing to do, is to add that display property. So that's our order. Let's hop over to order lines. So I want to create a new model. I'm going to say new class. I'm going to call this order line. Again, the table is plural. The class is singular. So order lines table. Let's bring that up here. And in the order line model, bring this up. I've got my order ID. I've got my product ID. Quantity. Yep.
Wasn't this like automatically generated last time?
So here's an interesting thing. Unfortunately, only the way that we started it up with Code First, it automatically generates it the first time you go through the process when you initially create the DB context. Unfortunately, they haven't put in code generation where later on you can add more tables. So that first time it will generate the code for you. After that, unfortunately, you have to do it all yourself. So that's where you kind of have to start to understand the pieces and how to work with them. Because again, it'll help you that first time, but once you've created the DB context, the only way to get it to generate the code again is to delete the context and recreate it, regenerate it. So rather than doing that, I'm just going to create the tables manually. Create the rest of the code manually. Okay. Are any of those properties required?
All of them.
Yes. Graham?
That's one of them.
Yeah. All of them. So all of the properties are required. Okay. Which of these columns is the primary key?
Two of them.
Two of them. Graham, you had a hand up?
No.
Evan?
No, sorry.
Okay. So two of these are actually the primary key, which gets interesting. Okay. So when I define these attributes, I'm going to put the key attribute on both. Okay. If I just leave that as is, you're actually going to see an error when you try to connect to the database saying you can't do that. You can't have more than one column marked as the key. Okay. In fact, there is kind of a hint. The good news is there is kind of a hint in that error message that tells you what to do. But the way you need to solve that is you have to add another attribute that says the order of those columns. Okay. So the attribute I'm going to add in here is the column attribute. That column attribute, I need to specify the order. That's how it's going to deal with the fact that I have a composite key. So column 0, column 1.
Did you import the schema? Is that what it was?
Yeah. Data annotations and data annotation schema. So if you have a composite key, you'll need that column attribute as well. And the order that I have there is based on the order in the SQL. So they were in this order in this equal, so that's the order that they need to be in as far as that order is specified. You can kind of see if I hover on this, it says gets or sets the zero-based order of the property amount to. So starts at 0, goes up. So that's my schema. That's my starting point for my schema. I now have the order and the order line table set up, or do I? Was there one more step I needed to do?
You need to set the foreign keys.
So remember, how do I connect to the database? I connect to the database, I use a SportsStore database, right? Notice that as far as it's concerned, it still only has one table, right? So I need to remember to go back to the DB context and add properties for those other tables. So public virtual DB set order, it's going to be orders So again, you'll note what's on the left is singular, what's on the right is plural, right? This has to match up with the name of my class.
So what does exactly this do?
So this is letting it know what tables that we have. Saying, hey, for this table, use this model. Otherwise, it doesn't know what class, the connection between the model classes and the tables, it wouldn't know otherwise. Does that make sense? We're telling it how those things are connected.
I think you also have to set the precision for order lines.
I don't have to. I could. I don't actually have to. It will work just fine if I don't set it, as it turns out. But I could put that there. I don't have to. The important thing to know is anytime you add a new table, you need to create the model class and add it to the DB set. Those are the two parts that have to happen on the C# process. But that's it. Those are the only two things you have to remember. So when we go back to our cart controller now that we have all the models set up, and go back to checkout. So remember I called here await, send order email, right? On a similar note, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to add another method. I'm going to say await, save order to database, cart, shipping info. So save the order to the database and then send out an email about the order. Okay. So I need to create that method. I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom of here and add a new method. Going to be private async task, save order to database. Because again, I want this ideally to be asynchronous. So in fact, if we look at the signature of these two, notice that they have the same signature. Send order email. The only thing that's different is actually the name of the method. So one thing to know there, does that mean, notice from that, I can't tell what the method's doing just by the input or output parameters, right? I need that name of the method to be descriptive, because otherwise I don't know what does this method do, what does that method do, right? Which is why I've put more descriptive words into here to say, send the order email, send the email, save to the database. So I know what the job of those two methods is, right? Scott, you had a hand up?
It's saying I'm missing an assembly reference for the async task.
Async task? Do you have space in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You should have already added it, but it should be this one. Should be using system threading tasks, but you should have already added it.
Yeah, I got that.
Okay. So
Oh, I got something.
yeah. So there's two things I need to do in this method. Okay. I need to save the orders and I need to save the order lines, right? Now I can't save those in any order I want. Okay. Remember, in the order lines table, that references the order ID from the orders table, right? So I can't actually save an order line until I know what the order ID is, right? I can't actually save it until I know what the order ID is. So I've got to save the order first, okay? So first thing I want to do anytime I want to save something to a table, I first need to create an object of that type. So I'm going to say var order is equal to new order, and I'm going to say order date is equal to date time dot now. Date time dot now is going to grab the current date and time, and that's when I want to save as the order date. Now it's going to grab that on the server. It's not going to grab that on the browser. So whatever time, whether or not the browser's off, doesn't necessarily matter for this, but it is going to matter if the clock on your server is wrong. That does happen, right? So it is important to try as much as we can to try and keep the server date up to date. The server clock up to date, that doesn't always happen, but just recognize this is running off of the date and time on the server. Okay. The next thing I need to do, now that I've created that object, I need to add it to the table. So I'm going to say db.orders.add, which if you look at that, that looks exactly like I'm adding it to a list, right? From what you're seeing there, there should be no difference between that and adding it to a list, right? If I'm adding it to a list, I just call add and add the thing, right? But I'm adding this to a database, right? Now, one important thing to know, this doesn't actually add it to the database automatically. That's one thing to know. That's one thing that sometimes gets people tripped up. At this point, it's queued up, and it will be added to the database eventually, but it is not added to the database yet, okay? Because what I haven't done is I haven't told it to save the changes, okay? I need to tell it to, yes, I really want to do this, okay? I really want you to go make the changes I told you to do. So the way I do that, I'm going to say await db.save changes async. So that's going to tell it to go and save all the changes I just made, which in this case is just adding an order to the database. Okay. At this point, it's just remembering it. It's just keeping that information in memory. It actually hasn't told the database anything about it. At this point is where it's going to actually run the SQL, this SQL that runs on the server against the database and make the changes.
Is there a non-async version of that? Or
Huh?
is there a non-async version of that?
There is. It's just DB save changes. But please, please, please always use the synchronous version of the asynchronous version. Simply because going to the trip to the database to call save changes is an expensive call. You don't want to block during that time. That's a definite case. That's the line you want to await. If you're going to wait one line in your code, it's the save changes line that you want to await. Does that help, Graham?
Yeah.
So there is a version, but you definitely want to call the asynchronous version. So that's added the order. And in fact, one interesting thing that happens, if we were to look at this in the debugger, right? Recognize at this point, before I've called save changes, what is the order ID?
Not generated yet.
It's not generated yet. In fact, what is it going to be? What is the order ID at this point in memory? I haven't set the order ID to anything, so it's going to be 0, right? At this point, the order ID is going to be 0, right? So if I were to use that order ID without calling save changes, I would get an order ID of 0, which would be invalid. Okay? I would get an order ID of 0. Because I'm telling it to await, it's going to go to save that. It's actually going to go ahead and return that ID and put it into the product ID, into the order ID for us. It's actually going to go ahead and get it once it's been added. So I don't actually have to do any more work to go get the order ID. It will already be on that object. So, created that. I need to now create the lines. Okay? So, there is more than one way that I could create these lines. Okay? One option is I could do a for loop, right? I could do a for loop. I could loop through all the lines in the cart and create a new order line, right? I could do that. Which, let me just run through that and show you how you would do that. This is not the way I would recommend doing it, but you can. So we'd say cart line in cart dot lines, and I can say db dot order lines dot add order ID is equal to okay. So I could loop through the cart lines and create an order line for each of them, add it, and then after that's all done, save the changes. Okay? This will work. This will work. It has a big performance drawback to it, though. Okay, and when I write, the way I add data to the database, which is what both of these are doing. This add is adding data to the database. In order to add to the database, what I write in SQL is called an insert statement. Okay. Now, the way this is going to generate the insert statements, each insert statement is going to insert one item. Every insert statement is going to generate one item. Okay. Which means that, let's say I've got 100 of these I'm adding, 100 products I'm adding to a order. I'm running 101 insert statements, right? That's not ideal. That's actually very significantly slow. So what I'd like to do instead is to run 2 insert statements, right? I'd like this to be one insert statement and that to be another insert statement. Because in the SQL syntax, I can actually add more than one row at once, and that's actually quite a bit faster to add multiple rows at the same time. Okay. Now, the way to do that, I have to call add range instead of add. Okay. Add, because add is going to end up resulting in them all being queued up as separate inserts. I need to call add range to add them all at once. Okay? How can I do that? How can I re-swizzle this code so I can call add range?
Just spitballing here, but maybe you could, I mean, you could still use a for each loop to set up, well, not a for each loop, but a for loop to set up and make an array, and then just add that all at once.
Yeah, so that would be one option. I could add it to a list. I'd probably do a list. Add them all to a list, and then add that whole list to the database. What's another option I could do?
Could you make the list inside of the method, the method to add them all, the add range? Can you put the list inside add range without?
I could. I could. How would I do that? Is there anything helpful in Link for me to do that?
Dot select.
Select is helpful. Remember, I've got a toList method, right?
Yeah.
If I can get it to something iterable, some sort of iterable thing, then I could call toList and turn it into a list. But really, actually, add range takes anything that's iterable, so I can actually skip the toList step. So yes, select is very helpful. How can I use select to speed this up a bit? How can I use select here?
Yeah, you can use select to select new order line and then input what properties it should use for it.
So yes, that's what I want to do. So let's start this out. So I'm going to say db order lines. Actually, keep the old version just so we can look at it next to each other. db.orderlines. Why is this going over? So dot. What? Did I break something here? Okay. I want to say dot add range, and that you can see what does it take? It takes an IEnumerable order line. So anything that gives me an IEnumerable is fair game, right? Doesn't have to be a list. So I can say, well, what list do I want to start with? What list am I transforming? I'm starting with cart lines, right? Actually, let me do this as 2 steps. So I'm going to say var lines is equal to cart.lines, because that's what I'm starting with, the lines in the cart. And then I'm going to say select. Again, remember, if you're familiar with JavaScript map, we mentioned this, JavaScript map works in a similar way as select. So what I need to do is I need to give it a delegate to say, take the cart line and turn it into an order line, right? There's a definite one-to-one relationship between those two things, between cart lines and order lines. So I'm going to say X arrow. I'm going to say new order line. So for each of these each of the cart lines, I want to make an order line, and I want to set the properties kind of like I set them up here. Product ID is equal to line.product ID this is X.
Forgetting a comma.
Yeah, I'm forgetting a few things. Yes?
Wouldn't you want to make that asynchronous, that select?
So, no. So cart lines is in memory already. Cart lines is in memory. Do you remember that? Because I've already pulled it out of the session variable. So that part is already in memory, which means I don't have to wait for a database or anything to get that data. Does that make sense? There's actually no database call in here. I'm not accessing an external resource to do any of this stuff. So async is usually when I have something involved that it's going to be slow to go access, whether it's a database or go send an email or anything like that. That's where I want to be asynchronous. This is all in memory, so there's no reason to be asynchronous. There's no point where it's actually going to block and have to wait for the disk or something like that. So this is going to transform the cart lines and order lines. And you can see a very similar thing is happening up here with the for each loop. Notice that in both cases here I'm doing a transformation, right? Here I'm looping through the cart lines and I'm transforming them into order lines, right? So it's a slightly different syntax, but effectively the same thing's happening, right? In both cases I'm doing a transformation from one thing to another. And then finally, once I've got those lines, I just add them to the database. So that's going to result in this being done as 2 insert statements instead of 101, or however many statements it needs to do.
Now might be a good time for a break.
Yeah. Before we do, though, are there any questions? Questions on how this works?
I'm just confused how this is more efficient for the database.
How this is more efficient
Yes.
versus that?
Yes.
The difference being, you see I'm calling average
Yes.
versus calling add a bunch of times. That means that this is one insert make statement versus insert statement per row. So there's some overhead every time you run an insert statement in SQL.
Okay.
That's why. There's some overhead.
So how does the add range function then? Because, sorry, just answer what you're going to say.
So it generates different SQL. That's the difference.
Oh, okay.
The SQL that this generates is different than the SQL that generates.
And that okay, that makes sense.
When we come back, I can write that up on the board and we can see how that will look. But there's a difference in the SQL between those two, which means there's a difference in speed. Okay. No other questions? So let's go ahead and take a break and come back at 3:35. So just to look at the SQL real quick, just a crash course on the SQL, because we haven't talked too much about it, but to give you a kind of intro to a few things there. So if I want to say, go look at the data that's there, what I can start with, I'm going to right click on SportsStore, and I'm going to say New Query. Okay, I'm going to say New Query. I want to say use SportsStore at the top of the script just to make sure I'm on that database. You'll notice I do have SportsStore selected here, but remember, if I get logged off, that's going to reset to master. So I'm going to put that line in there.
What did you put to get to where you are right now?
So I said right click on here and said New Query. Right clicked on the database and said New Query. Okay. So the way I look at data, the way to look at data in SQL is to use the select query. And the basic syntax of that is like so. Select star from orders. So that'll give me all of the columns, all of the data from the orders table. Okay. Right now you'll see that there's no data there. Once I run that, you'll see that there's no data down here. Okay. So let's go add in some data. Okay. To add in a row, I need to use what's called an insert statement. Okay. So an insert statement looks like this. Say insert what table, what columns do I want to insert into, and what values do I want to put into those columns. Okay. So this is going to set the order date to the 1st of September, the ship date to the 3rd of September. Okay. You don't actually need to type this in. If you want a copy of it, I'll give you a copy of it as soon as we're done with this. So if I run this, you'll see I can get, okay, September 1st, September 3rd. So that's the basic syntax for adding a row, right? I can run this again, and it'll keep adding rows to it. Okay. Now, if I want to add more than one row at once, well, one option for me to do that is to just write a bunch of insert statements like so. Okay. So this will insert 3 rows, one by one, right? So insert 3 rows, one by one. Insert orders, yada, yada, yada. That'll insert 3 rows, one by one. I have another option where I can insert, another way that I can write this, where I'll insert all 3 rows at once. Okay? So this syntax is going to be inserting one by one. You notice the only thing that changes is I separate the values with a comma. So this is going to be 1 insert statement. This is going to be 3 insert statements. Okay. Now, one thing to remember, anytime we're working with databases, right? Our websites are pretty much always going to have more than one user, right? In fact, we're going to want to have a lot of users on our website. Well, all those users need to work with the database, and oftentimes they need to work at the database at the same time. Okay. Now, there's a problem with all of the users accessing the database at the same time. And if we let them just do that free reign, well, we would end up with garbage. Everything would break because they would kind of overwrite and things would be a mess. So we actually have to momentarily say, this user, okay, you want to modify the data? Okay, you have exclusive access for it for a little bit, and then you go do your thing, and now give everybody else access again, right? So you kind of have to, what we call, lock the table. You have to lock the table in order to actually make changes to the table, okay? Well, the way this works, here I'm locking the table 3 times. Here I'm locking the table once. I'm only having to ask for permission to write to the table once here versus I'm having to ask for every row here, okay? As it turns out, generally speaking, asking for permission, getting permission to write that table takes longer than actually writing the data. That's the thing to know. It usually takes longer to get permission and give back permission to deal with that permission. That locking usually takes longer than actually writing the data. It's not a hard or fast rule, but usually it's quite a bit longer. So whereas inserting 100 rows this way could easily take less than a second, you might see inserting 100 rows, just 100, Might take a whole second to just do it that way, because of the difference in performance. Okay. Writing the data is very fast, but getting permission to be the only one that's writing that data oftentimes takes you some time, especially if other people actually want to write that data. Okay, does that help explain? So this is the SQL that we end up getting if we use add range. If we use add range, we get this SQL. If we just use add, we get this SQL. Does that make sense? So that's part of why, if we're adding stuff to the database, ideally, if we're adding multiple rows at once, we want to call add range rather than just calling add. Okay. So that being said, you may remember lists have add and add range. So as far as that's concerned, adding to the database here using Entity Framework, the only difference is it's like we're adding it to a list and then we're just calling save changes. So there's not a whole lot of difference between a list and working with a DB set. Okay? Let's just make sure this works. So I'm going to add something to my cart. Let's add 2 more things to my cart. Continue shopping. Let's add another soccer ball. So I've got, oh, I goofed. I need to go fix that. I think we did already talk about this, but I didn't get my code up to date for the example. Okay. Link banking, soccer, let's add another soccer ball. Okay, there we go. So I've got bling blinking and 2 soccer balls. Let's go check out. I'm going to fill that information in. And let's go look at what the database shows. So going here, let's see, select star from orders. There's the order I just added. So you can see 9:16, 15:43. Notice that that's in military time, but it is the local time. I'm going to say select star from order lines. Data's there. So we've got the order we added, and we've got the order line that we added. So you can see order 5, product 13, and product 19.
Where do you see, how do you pull up that window?
How do I pull up this?
Bottom window.
You just run that code. You say execute.
We
Yep.
don't need to insert anything like you did.
No, you don't have to. You don't have to. That's what I was saying. You don't need to write this out. But what I would recommend you do is go at this point, make sure that works. You know, assuming you've got all that code in, run it, add, make an order, see that you have that data showing up in the order lines table.
What does it say about, well, the circuit board reference? Not orders on this. That's why, okay, so go back. So invalid column in price per unit. No price, sir. It's a typo. So
the database first. Check the table first. And then you're gonna check the table first. So the table is price per day. So where's the model? See price. Cart controller. So it says cannot insert value null into the order ID column. So where's your code? There you go. I'm missing this. So primary key identity. Yeah, that's what you're missing. Because you don't have the word identity, it's not automatically figuring out the that's all you needed. Yeah. So it looks like it's working. Cool. What's going on over here?
Well, I kind of two things I wanted to know. You get a missing error. I'm not sure where it's coming from.
You're trying to. Oh, it's, I know where it is. So you see it says, cannot convert an iron removal order lines to an iron removal with orders.
Yes.
Right? Well, look at what type order lines is. It's a DB set order.
So I made the mistake when I was.
Yeah, it should be order line.
Yeah, okay, and then I have one more question. So I made, I made a mistake in my order lines, my order line, and just out of habit said order data and ship data instead of date. Just being quick. And I need to.
Yeah,
I know, so, right, but, so, and then I started to publish it, and it was giving me that same error same error from before. Oh, okay.
So actually, what you're gonna see here, let me click on here. See this check. So it says, what is the comment about that? The product key is being dropped. So there you go. So kind of that. Okay, drop that. You do. The other column in B, so it's gonna drop that. And then also look at this. It's saying it's gonna drop order date and ship date.
Okay, that's what I want.
You want. Right. So all we need to do is just comment out the check. Yes, we know we're gonna lose data, we don't care, we're trying. The call is just wrong. So just comment those out. Come on, yeah, this one. So now it's updated. So that'll happen with the data. It's like, oh, you might lose data.
I just gotta actually, I don't know. It's
You just gotta read the message.
Yeah, okay, cool.
And say, yes, I'm okay with that, basically. This is trying to save you from losing information.
So now, I should be okay if I want to run this. I just run from wherever it is, I will actually run this.
So you have an order date.
Yep. And what's in the order list?
You know what?
So select solid term orders, sorry.
So, and what was in the order? Was that it? Okay. So that looks right. It looks like there should be things that we indicate. So I will see things. Let's go back and look at your price. Yeah, also changes. So after that, some changes. You go into your database. Go into the database. Yeah. So you go in that. So what if you mess up? Here's what I'm imagining.
Your phone got up, right?
Just now. File names in wow. So remember, so I told you this before. Remember when we went any runs that we have highlighted? Only runs that we have highlighted. That's a highlight part of the line. That's what happened. So when we did that, so we got your that's a good way to get screwed up. Highlighting part of the line can be used in the so they have it, paying attention to yeah. Because it only takes a painfully easy.
So that kind of puts us where I want to be, where I'm going to leave that. Obviously, we'd want to save the shipping details in there as well. I'd recommend you walk through that yourself to save the shipping details. And the way I would recommend going about that, note that in the models folder, we already have, this is the wrong one. In the models folder, we already have the shipping details object. Turn that into a table. Make a table, match it up with this. You're going to need to add an ID because there's nothing here that can be considered a primary key. So you'll need to add an identity column to this and use that to save the table, save the data.
Would we just use the order ID?
You could, but that would preclude you in the future from being able to use the same shipping details on more than one order. That makes sense?
Like if they wanted to like save it.
If they want to save it, right? So instead, add an ID to this column.
So the shipping details has its own ID?
Yes, so it'd be like shipping details ID. Okay. Now, one interesting thing you're going to run into when you do that Remember that there's a default in Entity Framework where it tries to figure out, okay, classes should be plural, classes should be singular, tables should be plural. Well, it just guesses based on the fact there's an S at the end. So it's not going to really get this right. Okay. So what you want to do to fix that, you can tell it what the actual name of the table is. Table. So adding that attribute to the actual class will tell it which table to use. So that way it'll be using the shipping details table, rather than trying to add and remove S's on you. So. That's really good.